So, good evening, and thank you for joining us this lovely May Day for some spring storytelling. So my name's Kat, and I'm the Community Engagement Officer at Trees for Life. And I'm joined tonight by wonderful storyteller Emma and Rory from brilliant local charity Nature for Health, and I will let them introduce themselves properly shortly. So for me, it's felt like a really long winter. I don't know about you. And I do love winter, but I'm really happy to be seeing signs of spring all around at the moment. It feels like it's suddenly happened in the last couple of weeks. There are flowers in bloom everywhere. There's lovely yellow gorse, wood anemones, all sorts of different things. Birds and insects are active again. And just this week, loads of leaf buds burst and the trees are returning to their lovely green colours. So this time of year has been important to people for many thousands of years. And for the girls, it's Latha Buidhe or Latha Buidhe Bealtainn, which is the bright or yellow day of Beltane or bright May Day. And it's a time when spring is celebrated and preparations are made for the season ahead, whether that is looking after livestock or planting crops, looking after crops, that sort of thing. All sorts of preparations to be made in spring, ready for the year ahead. And tonight we will be celebrating with some wonderful stories, and we're really glad that you can join us. So over to you, Rory.
Good evening from sunny Scotland, and happy Beltane, everyone. It's lovely to have you here. So we're N4H Nature for Health, which is a local charity working using nature as a resource to support mental health. And our amazing Emma is going to be doing some storytelling. She will be using fire at some point, so do not try any of the fire tricks that she does at home. Many of them are very dangerous, and she's highly trained and highly experienced and highly insured. So do not try this at home. But thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a lovely Beltane evening. I'm going to hand over to Emma.
Fabulous. Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Rory. So happy Beltane, everybody. This is one of my favourite days of the year. This is the official end of winter, the beginning of summer. And as Kat says, it's a time for rebirth and the trees are all blooming. We saw some little blaeberry buds when we were out today on the bushes, and it was just a wee bit magical. So I thought I would start off this evening by talking just a wee bit more about Beltane and about one of my favourite characters from traditional Scottish mythology who is very active during that time. So Beltane is one of the fire feasts. It's one of the most important nights of the Celtic calendar. There are, I think, 4 of these fire festivals through the year that have very auspicious moments through the year in terms of lunar cycles and marking the seasons. So as I say, Beltane is the end of winter, the start of summer, and it's traditionally celebrated with fire, because fire was thought to have wonderful cleansing, healing, protective qualities. So hundreds of years ago, not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, when we were a very agricultural nation, people's livelihoods were so dependent on the elements and on the weather. If there was too much rain or not enough rain, the crops wouldn't thrive. There could be issues with fishing, issues with livestock if it was a long, cold, hard winter. So appeasing whatever spirits or deities were in charge of the weather and the elements was incredibly important, and there were lots of superstitions and rituals around this. So Beltane was a very important fire ritual. I'm getting a bit of feedback from Rory's camera over there, sorry. Dear me. Okay, so people who worked in agriculture, one of the main Beltane rituals they had was that they would build 2 huge Beltane bonfires. And between these bonfires, they would drive their cattle out to the summer pastures to get nice and fat on the new grass for the coming season. And again, this was because the smoke from the fires was said to have protective qualities. It could ward off evil spirits. And the Beltane fires were thought to have so much power that people wanted it to come into their homes. So they would douse every fire, every candle in their wee crofts, and they would relight them from the Beltane fire. And it was coming to the end of winter, so there may not have been that much food about still they may have been able to harvest some new growth from the spring, but there wouldn't have been much left over from the year before. So they would take some of this precious leftover food and they would throw a feast. And one of the traditional Scottish things they would make would be these wee oatcakes that they would cook in the fire called bannocks. And I love that they would have these bannocks to themselves, but they would break off little pieces as offerings for the different type of livestock that they had. So there would be a wee bit for the cattle, a wee bit for the sheep, a wee bit for the pigs. So I mentioned one of my favourite characters around Beltane, and this is the Kalyan. I'm sure many of you will have heard of the Kalyan. She's incredibly well known. She's a very ancient tale from Celtic mythology, so she's known throughout Scotland, Ireland, all the wee islands, even the Isle of Man, I think. But she is Our Lady of Winter. She is the goddess of winter. But she's not how you might picture a traditional goddess. The Kalyan appears, it said, as a wee twisted old woman with blue skin and white hair. Some say she has rust red teeth and one eye. She's quite a sight to behold, I imagine. But looks can be deceiving. This wee old hag is incredibly powerful. With her, on her back, she carries a creel, a basket full of rocks and stones. And many thousands of years ago, it said that she was wading in the sea and some stones fell from her basket. And these stones formed the islands all around Scotland. And she took some more rocks and placed them on the land. And these became her stepping stones. But nowadays we know them as the mountains. She also carried a magical staff, and the staff was just imbued with the power of winter. Wherever she set it down, the land would freeze, and she could summon incredible storms and blizzards and tempests, rain, hail, snow, you name it. She was incredibly powerful. Now, some of my favourite wee Kalyan stories are, one of them comes from the west coast of Scotland, a place called Corribrechin, which literally translates from the Gaelic to cauldron of the plaid. And it said, at the coming of winter, the Kalyan will take her great plaid and she'll wash it in the churning waters, the churning cauldron at Corribrechin. For 3 days, she'll wash her plaid. And it said that from miles around, up to 20 miles inland, this coming tempest can be heard as a roar in the distance. And by the time she pulls her plaid out, it's sparkling white. And by this time, snow is said to lie across the land. Another important date to the Kalyan is Imbolc, the 1st of February. Now, this was an important day because the Kalyan was running out of firewood to keep her going through her long winter months. So on Imbolc, she would set out and gather firewood to last her the rest of the winter. And it's still a tradition to some superstitious people to this day that if the 1st of February is bright and sunny and beautiful, it can mean that it's going to be a long winter ahead because the Kalyan has had loads of time to gather as much firewood as she needs. But if Imbolc, the 1st of February, is dark and grey and a wee bit stormy, it could mean that the Kalyan has overslept and she's not able to collect as much wood to keep her going. So it could mean that we might be in for a shorter winter. Now, there are absolutely hundreds and hundreds of different Kalyan tales, different versions of Kalyan tales from Ireland, Isle of Man, all over Scotland. And more recent tellings sometimes portray her as this very evil, evil person, goddess, deity, because she is said to defeat Bride, the goddess of summer, and claim the land and spread her icy hold over everything. But way back, very traditionally, she's neither good nor evil. Instead, she brings important balance to the seasons. She makes sure that things have a time to rest, to be reborn eventually in spring and summer. And she's just very important to the cycles of nature. So every Samhain, so Halloween in more recent parlance, that's when the Kalyak comes back. Before that, we have warmth, lovely warmth and growth and greenery from Bride, our goddess of spring and summer, and all the crops will grow, all the livestock can eat lovely green grass. But then at Samhain, that warmth goes out as the Kalyak defeats Bride and reclaims her place in the land. So, but we'd have a wee go at having a wee symbol of the putting out of the warmth of summer. And coldness and darkness can fall upon the land. But of course, Beltane today is when the Kalyak is defeated. She's sent back, banished to her cave in the mountains, her icy wee cave, and we welcome Bride back into the land. Okay, so the Kalyak is one of my favourite magical, mystical deities from Scottish traditional lore. But I wanted to tell another couple of stories featuring some of slightly different magical beings, maybe not powerful enough to be able to turn the world to ice, but still they would have their own powers, which I hope we'll discover. So our first story takes place hundreds of years ago, when the land was maybe just a wee bit more magical. And it takes place somewhere in Scotland. No one's quite sure where. We've got lovely setting here. I don't know if you can hear the bird song through the camera, but it's through the microphone, but it's really beautiful. Lovely. It's blackbird, beautiful. Anyway, so maybe they'd be hearing this in my story. So many hundreds of years ago, it was very agricultural. A lot of people, if they didn't live in the towns and villages, they may have had wee crofts out in the middle of nowhere. They would have been very self-sufficient, growing their own crops. They may have been lucky enough to have a cow or two for milk, maybe a wee flock of sheep so that they could spin their own wool. And they would grow all their own veggies to eat then, and maybe store some for winter. Maybe they grow some grains. So our story takes place, it begins at one such croft. One wee cottage in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in Scotland. No one's quite sure where. But in this wee cottage, there lived a widowed woman and her two daughters. And they were hardworking. They grew loads and loads of lovely veggies. Their specialities were their neeps. Their neeps fetched a high price when occasionally they would make the long journey into town to sell their extra food for a bit of money to keep them going through the winter. But one day, this wee family, the mother and the two daughters, woke up to find that something pretty terrible had happened. They looked out into their lovely veggie patch, which usually would have beautiful rows of the greens of carrots coming up, the greens and the wee flowers of tatties, and their beautiful prize-winning neeps, to find that a huge chunk of their veggies had been dug up and had vanished. So this wasn't just annoying for them, this was a matter of life and death. If it was going to be a cold winter, if the Kalyak was going to have a tight grip over the land, then it might be tricky to store enough food for the winter. So the eldest daughter, who was very brave, very proud, maybe a wee bit headstrong, maybe even a wee bit selfish, she said, "Never fear, I'm going to stay up all night tonight. I'm going to find out what on earth has happened to our veggies during the night. And maybe it's animals, maybe it's a person, but whatever it is, I'm going to scare it off." She was true to her words. Night fell. She took a wee stool out with her. She wrapped herself up in her cloak and she sat out by where they grew their vegetables. And she perched herself on her stool and she waited. And she waited. was getting very dark. It was getting a wee bit cold. And her head was starting to nod. Her eyes were getting a bit heavy. When all of a sudden, the ground began to shake. And she heard the loudest thump, thump, thump that she'd ever heard. She looked up, and coming over the hill at the edge of the veggie patch, silhouetted in the moonlight, was a huge, fearsome giant. Now, like I say, this eldest daughter, she was pretty brave. So she stood up to her full height and said, "Mr. Giant, you're not welcome here." Of course, to the giant, this wee squeaky girl just sounds like a wee mouse in his ear. He doesn't know what to make of it. So he sets about his business, scooping up as much of their wonderful crops and vegetables as he can fit in his giant-sized sack. The wee sister, the eldest sister, stamps her foot and says, "No, put those back. We need those to eat and to sell, and they're going to keep us going through the winter." And finally, the giant notices where this wee squeaky noise is coming from, and he looks down and he sees this eldest daughter, and he has a plan. He says, "You're coming with me. I have a job for you." And quick as a wink, he scooped her up in his giant hands, shoved her into his bag with all the neeps and carrots he'd pilfered, threw it over his shoulder, and stomped away. Of course, the eldest daughter doesn't know where they're going. They seem to walk for hours, when eventually she's tumbled out onto what appears to be a giant-sized table in a giant-sized kitchen. And she blinks and she looks about her, and by now she's pretty scared. And the giant says to her, "I have a job for you. I see your nimble wee fingers. I bet you would make a fine jumper for me out of that huge sack of wool I've got." And sure enough, in the corner of the room, there was a big mound of fresh wool, freshly shorn. Nothing had been done to it. The little girl flipped and looked back at the giant and noted the size of his huge giant jumper. It was the biggest piece of clothing this girl has ever seen. And she said, no way. Do you know how much work goes into making a jumper, making anything out of wool? That fresh new wool needs to be washed, and it needs to be carded, and it needs to be combed, and it needs to be spun and wound and woven. And oh my goodness, that's a very long task indeed. That's asking a bit much. The giant, of course, didn't care. He said, "You will make me a jumper, and you will make it by dawn, or else." And with that, he stomped his way out of the kitchen and locked the door behind him. This eldest sister was at a bit of a loss, but she was a pretty determined wee girl. She decided she would give it her very best shot. She didn't see that she had any other option. But just as she was thinking about getting the first of the wool washed, she felt such a rumbling in her tummy. So she had a wee glance about the kitchen, and she saw some lovely fresh porridge oats sitting on the side. So she thought, aha, I'm going to need plenty of energy to keep me going through this long night. I'm going to start with a wee bowl of porridge, I reckon, which is quite sensible. And so she found a giant-sized saucepan, a giant-sized spoon, but with a bit of work, she managed to make herself a bowl of porridge. She settled down and started to eat. When the second strangest thing she'd seen that day happened, out from a mouse hole in the ground, just at the base of the skirting board, there popped a wee face. Now, in some places, we might call these wee creatures fairies. In others, away up north, they might call them the trows. In this story, we're going to call them the peerie folk. They were teeny tiny wee people-ish. They had pointy ears, yellow hair, and hundreds, it seemed like hundreds of them were pouring out of this mouse hole, and each one was carrying a teeny wee bowl. Some of the bowls were made from half of a hazelnut that had been gnawed out. Some were the little hats you find on acorns, but each one had a teeny wee bowl. And one of them sort of scurried forward and said, "Wee lass, will you do us an awful kindness? You see, we're so terribly hungry. Would you mind sharing your porridge with us?" And the eldest sister looked at them, and she was obviously a wee bit shocked, but she was pretty hungry and maybe a wee bit selfish. And she said, "No, I need all the porridge I can have. I've got a huge task ahead of me this evening. I've got to turn all that wool into a jumper, and by dawn, it's just, oh, I need my porridge." And she sent them away. And all these wee peery folk scuttled away back down the mouse hole and were gone. Now, this eldest sister, she worked really, really hard all through the night until her hands were sore and her fingers were raw, and she barely even started. There was a huge mountain of wool to be turned into wool that could be used for spinning. It needed to be washed and sorted and combed and carded. Oh, there was just too much to do. It was too big a task. So when the giant came back at dawn and saw that she'd barely even made a start, he was pretty furious. He snatched her up, took her somewhere deep in the castle, and locked her in a cupboard. Back home, back at the wee cottage, the mother and the youngest sister were awful worries. They had no idea where their sister had gone, whether she'd been taken, and there were more vegetables missing. It was just a bit of a nightmare. So the wee sister, who was maybe not quite as brave as the elder sister, but she was a good thinker and she was very kind. She desperately wanted her sister back. She said, "You know what? I'm going to stay up tonight. I'll figure out what's taking our crops. Maybe I'll figure out what's taking our sister and I'll bring her home." And so night fell and she took out the stool and she waited by the vegetables. And sure enough, once it was full dark, just the moonlight peeping between the clouds, she felt the ground shake and she heard the thump, thump, thump coming over the hill. She looked up to see the giants appearing at the edge of their vegetable patch. Now this wee sister, she was pretty terrified, but she was brave. She stood up and she said, "Mr. Giant, have you taken all our vegetables? And more importantly, have you taken my sister?" And the giant noticed her and said, "Well, yes, I'm a giant. I can do what I like. But your big sister, she was pretty terrible. Maybe you'll do a better job." And he scooped her up, popped her in his sack, and hurried back to the castle. So just like her sister, this wee girl was tumbled out onto the table, and the giant gave her the exact same ultimatum. He said, "I want that wool made into a beautiful giant-sized jumper by dawn, or you'll meet the same fate as your sister." And he stomped out, slammed the door, and locked it behind him. So this youngest sister, they were very much alike, these sisters, in that they knew they needed a bit of energy to keep going through the night. And so the youngest sister thought, I might have some of these porridge oats. I might just have a wee bowl of porridge to keep me going. It's going to be a long night. And so just like her sister, she made herself a bowl of porridge. And just like her sister, she saw the remarkable sight of some wee faces popping out of a mouse hole at the bottom of the wall. And these peery folk scuttled out and they all lined up, holding up their wee bowls. And they said, "Wee lass, your sister didn't give us any of her porridge. Would you be so kind? Our wee bellies are so rumbly." Now, this younger sister was different in that she was very kind, very generous. So she said, "Of course, absolutely. I'm sure your tummies are awful small. You won't take much help yourself." And she shared her porridge with them. So these wee fairies, they filled their bowls with about one little bit of porridge each. And when they were finished, they scurried back down the mouse hole. All but one, the biggest of the peery folk, who had a kind of bold way about him. He strode up to this younger sister and said, we know what's going on here. We know that you've been told to make a giant-sized jumper by dawn. I have a proposition for you. I and my friends will make you a giant-sized jumper by dawn if you can guess my name. We'll go away, make the jumper, come back, and at dawn, if you don't guess my name, there'll be trouble. So this younger sister, she realizes she's never going to get that done in the space of a night. So she agrees. She says, yes, okay, don't really have any choice. So all of the wee peery folk scuttle in, grab a wee bit of wool each, and there's so many of them that they manage to carry this huge pile of wool out down the mouse hole, and they vanish. So this wee sister, she sets about looking around for an escape. She's listening to see if she can hear her sister somewhere else in the castle. And she hears a knock, knock, knock on the door. Now she manages to climb up onto a stool and peer out of a wee window, and she sees a crooked old woman at the door, some sort of peddler woman. She has a basket full of lucky heather. She's maybe been going around selling it at the cottages. And this old woman says, oh, wee lass, it's awful cold out here the night. Would you mind letting me in and giving me some shelter, maybe something to eat? And the girl says, oh, I'm so sorry. I can't let you in. The door's locked. And more importantly, you wouldn't want to come in. This is the castle of the most fearsome giant you've ever seen. If you're wise, you'll go as fast as you can, as far as you can away from here. The old woman says, oh, thank you, my wee love. I had no idea. She's best of luck to you. And she scuttles away into the night. And from here, our story follows this old woman just for a wee while. Because this old woman runs away from the castle and passes a strange wee lump in the heather. And from this lump in the heather, she hears a very strange sound. It sounds a wee bit like singing. And she peers down a mouse hole and sees that this wee lump in the heather is actually the top of a cavern. And in this cavern, there are rows and rows of these peery folk working away at spinning wheels and buckets of water, washing and spinning. And at the front of them is the slightly larger one of the peery folk, the bolshy one. And he's cracking a wee fairy whip, and he's singing a fairy enchantment. Now, I can't sing a fairy enchantment, I've not got the magic for it, but I'm going to give it a wee go of what it might sound like to human ears. Wash and card and comb for me, work until your fingers bleed, spin and wind and weave the wool, or peery fool your master. This old woman thinks, oh, there is bad magic about these fairy enchantments. And she thinks, now, that wee lass stuck back at the castle, she did me a favour warning me about the giant. I'd best do her a favour and warn her about this evil fairy who's nearby. So she hurries back to the castle, knocks on the door again, and the wee lassie says, old woman, what are you doing back? I said, get far away from here, there's a giant. And the old woman said, aye, but there's maybe worse magic about. I've just seen something. And she explained about the fairy enchantment, and that it seemed that the fairy casting the enchantment, his name was Peeryfool. And the wee lass thought, oh, well, there can only really be one evil wee peery folk about the place. It must be him, that must be his name. And she thanked the old woman again and again and again, said, you've got me out of a tight scrape here. Now, get out of the way before that giant comes back. So the old woman hurries away. So the youngest sister waited, and sure enough, just before dawn, there came a rustling from behind the mouse hole, and out popped who we now know might be a wee peery folk called Peeryfool, and all of the other wee peery folk dragging and pulling on the biggest, most beautifully crafted jumper that the wee girl had ever seen. So the biggest one of these wee fairies stepped forward He said, now, wee lass, we have crafted you this beautiful jumper. Can you guess my name? So the youngest sister thought a bit and she said, this might be a wee bit tricky. I don't really know much about the names of the Peerie folk. Could it be, could it possibly be Peerieful? And as soon as she'd finished the word, there was a loud crack. And the spell that Peerieful had over the rest of these Peerie folk was broken. And you can imagine if someone cast a spell over you, you wouldn't feel too good about them. So Peerieful ran far away as quickly as he could before he had to face the anger of these poor wee Peerie folk who he'd cast the spell over. And these wee Peerie folk, they jumped and laughed and celebrated. It wasn't nice to be under a spell, under an enchantment. And they said, wee lass, is there anything we can do for you? We'll grant any of your wishes. You've set us free. What can we do? And the wee lass said, well, I'm in a bit of a predicament. And she explained about the giant who'd taken her vegetables, taken her big sister. And she said, I wish we were all just safe at home and that the giant was gone. And so the wee Peerie folk put their heads together and then they started to sing. Kind wee lass, you've set us free, so a wish we'll grant for thee. Giant cruel, be gone from here, we banish you forever. And as the final note of their enchantment faded, there was a loud crack, and the youngest sister opened her eyes to find herself back at her own croft. Not only was she back, but her sister was back as well. And her turnips and carrots and tatties had all magically regrown. And more importantly, no sign of a giant. There would never be the sign of a giant anywhere near that croft for the rest of time. Fantastic. I think we will have just a wee break just now for me to stoke my fire, and then we'll come back for a last wee story. So I want to move on. That was a bit of a kind of summer autumn story when all the crops are lovely and ripe and ready to be harvested, or some of them anyway. I know they finish at different times. But this next story is going to take place in the heart of winter. So our next story, again, involves a wee cottage in the middle of nowhere, as many traditional Scottish stories do. People told stories about the things that they knew. People could relate to having a wee cottage in the middle of nowhere, a wee croft. So that was what appeared in stories. But this wee cottage was in the middle of a thick, dark forest. And in this cottage there lived a father and a daughter. He was a widower as well, just like the last story. Like I say, people tell what they know. But he was a woodcutter. He worked in the forest, and he was very good at foraging for things to eat. And so they always ate very well, him and his daughter, and they were very, very happy there, their wee isolated cottage in the middle of the forest, somewhere in Scotland, in a deep forested area in Scotland. I wonder where that could be. But they were very happy, just the father and his daughter. And for this story, we're going to call her Mary. There are versions of this story from pretty much all over the world. So this is the Scottish version. So Mary and her father were very happy together in their wee cottage. But Mary's father started to think that maybe something was missing from their lives. He was worried that Mary was going to grow up without a mother figure. He wanted someone there to help look after her and keep her happy and keep her safe, and someone to love and share love with. And so one day, when he'd been in market selling his wood that he'd felled, his firewood, he met another widower, a woman. And this woman had two daughters of her own. And they both kind of thought, oh, perfect fate. Maybe it's meant to be. And like many things in the olden days, they got married very, very quickly. And wee Mary suddenly found herself with a new stepmother and 2 new stepsisters. So it was all very exciting. And at first, things were exciting. They were lovely. There were other wee girls to play with. And there were people to help out around the house and share stories with over the fire at night time. But then one day, in the depths of winter, pretty much the worst thing happened. And poor wee Mary, her father was out felling trees when one fell on him unexpectedly and he was killed. This is the worst part of the story, and I'm sorry, we're going to move on quickly. So poor wee Mary was left without her father, but she still had her stepmother and her 2 stepsisters. And for just a wee while, that seemed okay. But pretty quickly, things turned a wee bit nasty. Now, this stepmother and the 2 stepsisters were quite a jealous bunch. And they were jealous of Mary's relationship that she'd had with her father. They were jealous that she knew where to find all the nice things to eat and gather in the forest. And she had a kind of beauty about her from being just kind and loving the different creatures she would find. And it shone out of her. And the stepmother and the stepsisters, they were jealous. And so they set her to work around the house. She was forced to do all of the nasty chores, the dusting and cleaning the coal scuttle. And she was made to sleep in the wee cupboard with just a wee threadbare blanket to keep her warm. But still, even this punishment of poor wee Mary, who'd done nothing wrong, it wasn't enough for the stepmother and the 2 stepsisters. So they hatched a plan for how to get rid of her once and for all. So it was the depths of winter. It was an absolutely freezing winter. The Kalyan was in full force. Everything was covered in a layer of snow. The days were barely days at all before the night drew in, and it was freezing cold. And the stepmother thought, maybe I can use the season, weather, freezing coldness to do my job for me. She came up with a bit of a diabolical scheme. She called Mary to her and said, Mary, I think this house needs freshening up a bit. It needs livening up a bit. It needs something pretty. I want you to go out into the forest and find me some lovely fresh primroses to decorate the house. And Mary said, but stepmother, primroses, they're a spring plant. They definitely don't grow in the depths of winter under 2 feet of snow. There's no way I could find them. And the stepmother said, well, you'd better. Don't you dare come back unless you found me some nice primroses. Well, I'm hoping some of you know what primroses are. These beautiful little flowers. They're often seen growing on the riverbanks around Scotland. Usually yellow, but I have seen some other colours. They are really lovely. But like Mary was saying, they're definitely not something that's found in the middle of winter. Poor wee Mary, she didn't think that she had any choice at all. So she wrapped herself up in as many cloaks as she could, and she got her gathering basket, and she set out into the cold. She wandered, and at first she was a wee bit hopeful. Maybe there would be a wee pocket of warmth somewhere where spring had come very, very early, and she might find some new primroses. But of course, everything was frozen. There was feet of snow on the ground. There was barely anything green at all. It got colder and darker, and Mary was losing hope when up ahead she caught sight of a glimmering light between the trees. She walked forward, and as she came into the clearing, she saw one of the strangest sights she had ever seen. There were 12 wee creatures dancing around a fire in the clearing. They may have been fairies, trolls, peatyfolk, nymphs, but they were certainly magical. For one of them stepped forward and said, Mary, what are you doing out here in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter? You'll catch your death. And Mary sighed and said, well, I think that was the plan. But more importantly, how did you know my name? How did you know who I was? And the wee fairy creature said, we know everything that goes on in this forest. We like to keep an eye on things. But you haven't answered my question. What are you doing out in the cold? So she explained about her stepmother and how she demanded primroses and said that poor Mary couldn't go back until she had some. So the wee fairies stepped aside, they put their heads together, and then one of them stepped forward with a wee branch. He dipped his branch into the fire and said, Mary, my name is April, and I may be able to help you with your primroses. And so the fairy named April danced around the clearing, waving his torch, and wherever he touched it to the ground, the snow melted, and the most beautiful, pristine bunch of primroses grew out of nothing, all of a sudden. Now Mary couldn't believe it. She was flabbergasted, but delighted. This had basically saved her life. And so she picked only 3 of these beautiful magical primroses because she didn't want to be greedy. She thought, well, there'll be one there for my stepmother and one each for my 2 stepsisters. And she popped them into her gathering basket. She thanked the fairies again and again from the bottom of her heart. And she took a torch from the fire and set off back through the forest to her home. Can you do it? So she managed to find her way home. And you can imagine her stepmother's surprise and anger when Mary appeared. Not only had she survived the cold, dark freezingness of the forest, but she'd managed to produce these primroses, and they were just immaculate. They were the most beautiful, pristine primroses anyone had ever seen. She said, very well then, come back inside. She was a bit, for once, she didn't have any words. She had nothing to say. But she thought, I need to up the stakes a bit. I need to make this a wee bit more difficult. So the next night, she called Mary to her again. Said, Mary, the primroses they were okay. They brightened up the place a little bit, but I want something delicious to eat. Now I want you to go out there into the forest and pick me some lovely strawberries for me and my 2 real daughters. And don't you dare come back until you've found them. And so poor wee Mary again, she had no choice. She bundled herself into her cloak and went out into the forest. She tried to remember where she'd been, where she'd found the fairy clearing, but she just couldn't remember. So she wandered and wandered. She looked for strawberries, but she knew as well as we do, strawberries, they're a summer fruit. They go in the middle of summer. We're very lucky nowadays. We've got polytunnels and we can fly them over from hot places. But back then, you would only get fresh strawberries in the middle of summer. It was getting darker and colder and darker and colder when up ahead, she saw the flickering light and she rushed into the clearing with relief. And the fairy said, oh, Mary, you're back. What is it this time? Were the primroses not enough? And Mary said, no, she's asked for strawberries now. Strawberries, that's a summer fruit. So the fairies put their heads together, and then one of them stepped forward, tipping a special fairy powder into his hand. He said, now, Mary, my name is July, and I have the power of summer, and let's see if I can help you with your strawberries. He sprinkled the powder into the flames, and sparks flew up, and wherever a spark landed in the clearing, the snow melted and a beautiful vine of strawberries grew, and they just instantly ripened on the vine. They were the biggest, brightest, reddest strawberries Mary had ever seen. So she quickly gathered 3. She wasn't greedy. She didn't even take one for herself, just one for her stepmother and her 2 stepsisters, popped them in her basket, and she thanked the fairies from the bottom of her heart for saving her yet again, and hurried back to their cottage. Stepmother was furious. She gobbled down these strawberries as quickly as she could. And then she had a very long, hard think. She thought, what could be more difficult to find in winter than strawberries? So the next night, she called Mary to her and said, Mary, those strawberries, they were fine, but now I want some fresh apples for me and my 2 daughters. Mary said, apples? But they're an autumn food. They don't ripen until 9 months from now. And the stepmother said, yeah, well, I want fresh apples and don't come back until you found them. So poor wee Mary, she put on her cloak, picked up her basket and set out into the forest once again. Got darker and colder, darker and colder. She was just about to give up when, thankfully, she saw up ahead the flickering light. She rushed into the clearing and the fairies said, oh, Mary, what is it this time? And Mary hung her head and she said, apples, fresh apples in the middle of winter. They're not due for another 9 months. Fairies put their heads together and said, this is going to be a tricky one. But then one step forward said, Mary, my name is October and I may be able to help you. And October had a special pipe. He crouched low to the fire and blew. There was a fireball, a huge fireball engulfing the clearing, but everyone was safe. It didn't burn, it didn't touch anyone. It just melted the snow on all the trees around the clearing and on the branches of these trees. Now, these weren't apple trees, they were evergreens. There were things like Douglas firs and pine trees and things, Scots pines. But on their branches, as if by magic, these big, beautiful, ripe apples were growing. Mary couldn't believe her eyes. So she gathered 3 of these apples. Once again, she wasn't greedy. She thanked the fairies again and again and again. And she hurried back to the cottage. Her stepmother was furious and dumbfounded. She scoffed the apples, and then her eyes lit up. She got a strange, greedy gleam in her eyes. She called Mary to her and said, Mary, I demand you tell me where you found these apples, fresh apples in the middle of winter. If I could get more of these, I could sell them and make a fortune. Poor wee Mary. She really didn't want to get the fairies in trouble, but she was very honest and didn't think she could lie. And so she told the truth. She told her stepmother and her stepsisters about the magical fairy clearing and how they'd magicked up all this magical fruit for her and the flowers. And so the stepmother and the 2 stepsisters bundled into their cloaks, took as many baskets and bags as they could carry, and set out into the woods. Now, they searched and searched and searched for this fairy clearing that Mary had described, but they couldn't find it. It was getting darker and colder, but thankfully, eventually, they saw a flickering light up ahead. They hurried into the clearing. They met those 12 dancing fairies, and the stepmother strode in. She wasn't polite like Mary. She was a wee bit bullshit, this lady. And she said, fairies, I know that you can create amazing fresh fruit and flowers out of nothing. I demand that you make for me as many apples as me and my 2 daughters can carry. I'm going to sell them and make a fortune. And the wee fairies just looked at her and said, who are you to demand something from us? We know all about you and the plans you had for poor Mary. Now, people like you, folk like you around here, you should be very careful, especially in the middle of winter. There can be sudden storms that blow up from nowhere, sudden blizzards. Really, you should be careful. And the fairies stepped backwards and seemed to melt. They seemed to vanish into the forest. The fire in the center of the clearing died down. And sure enough, a wind began to howl around the clearing. And before they knew it, they were in the midst of a terrible blizzard. Now the mother and the two stepsisters were never seen again. Maybe they found their way out the other end of the forest. Maybe they froze. Maybe they were so scared they ran to a different part of the country. We'll never know. But one thing's for sure, they never made their way back to Mary's wee cottage. She was left by herself. But she liked it that way. She loved the forest and the things that grew there. She loved foraging and harvesting food, and she could really take care of herself. And so, as the saying goes, she lived happily ever after. Thank you very much. So we're just about finished. A couple of minutes. I really wanted to finish just with a wee Beltane blessing that was recorded from a crofter in Uist, which I love. This is authentic stuff. Not quite as authentic as it could be because I can't read Gaelic. So I'm going to read it in English, but I still think it's quite lovely. So this is a Beltane blessing. Bless, O threefold, true and bountiful, myself, my spouse, and my children, my tender children, and their beloved mother at their head, on the fragrant plain at the gay mountain shieling. Everything within my dwelling or in my possession, all kine and crops, all flocks and corn, from Hallow Eve to Beltane Eve, with goodly progress and gentle blessing from sea to sea and every river mouth, from wave to wave and base of waterfall. So I wish you all a magical Beltane. I hope your summer is wonderful and joyous and warm. And I will hand back to Kat, if that's okay, just to finish it up.
Hello. Thank you so much, Emma. That was absolutely lovely. I really enjoyed it. And I know a lot of other people did as well. We've had some lovely messages in the chat. Someone said, lots of thank yous coming in. And someone said, Emma's such a fantastic storyteller. She has me hooked. So I think people have really...
Thank you. That's so lovely. Thank
really
you.
Nice to hear the bird song and the crackling fire as well. It's a lovely atmosphere.
I'm enjoying it.
Oh, good.